in the years between 793 and 1066. The Norse took to the sea like wolves to the woods. From the cold fjords of Norway, the flatlands of Denmark, and the dark forests of Sweden, they hungrily made their way through the waves in longships. They struck like thunder. Monasteries, villages, towns, all fair game. Gold, silver, food, cloth. Whatever they could carry, they took. They left behind death and destruction. And this wasn't for empire. Not yet. First it was all for plunder. And the name, always the name. And so this story marks the fiercest of them. Men whose names bled into scrolls and sagas. Crews burned into memory by ink, bone and steel. There are no drunken songs of giants or gods here. Only what the old scribes wrote and what the ground still holds. Aye, the land remembers them. You've heard the names, though you may not know their roots. Faroe, Iceland, Greenland, Seaberg in Latvia, Polansk in Lithuania, Danelaw, Jorvik, or York, as they call it now, Cumbria, Arklow, Dyflin, or Dublin, Limericker, Limerick, Vedrafjordur, Waterford, Vikingerlaw, Wicklow, Veisafjordur, Wexford, Man, Caithness, Galloway, Kintyre, Nordreyar, Orkney and Shetland, Ross, Sudreyar, the Hebrides, Sutherland, Gardariki, Normandy. The bones of their passage lie in those names, and the English wrote of them in fear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a Wessex-made book of years, begun when Alfred wore the crown. But it's not clean truth, it's war writing. A shield wall of words swelling the numbers of Norsemen to make Saxon victory seem brighter. But the first blow landed earlier than most think. It wasn't Lindisfarne. No. The year 787, or maybe in 789. 3 ships, lost or scouting, came from Hordaland, from the western part of Norway near Hardanger Fjord. They landed at Portland in Wessex. The King Seriv Biduhard rode out. He thought these Northmen were traders. He told them to come see the king, to collect taxes maybe. However, the Vikings cut him down. Him and his men. Then they disappeared. The Chronicle wrote, these were the first ships of the Danish men that sought the land of the English nation. Aye. And with that, the first blood was drawn, and the sea didn't rest after that. Nor did the Norse. Now, there were raids before the stories began, raids no one wrote down. In 792, King Offa of Mercia granted protection to churches in Kent. However, he made one thing clear. No help would come should pirates came from the sea, and that warning was plain. However, the Norse were already striking. And around the same time, Alcuin of York, who was a monk and scholar, wrote to King Ethelred of Northumbria. He scolded the English for dressing like pagans, aping the very men who'd stalk their shores with axes and fire. The Norse watched closely. They knew where the gold was. And so in the year 793, the hammer fell. They came from the sea. Longships made their way up to Lindisfarne, the holy island. It was a quiet place, full of monks, prayers, and books. The Chronicle tells it like this. This year came dreadful forewarnings. Great sheets of light in the sky, whirlwinds, fiery dragons flying across the firmament, and after, a great famine. Then, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, heathen men made lamentable havoc in the church of God by rapine and slaughter. They struck Lindisfarne at dawn. Monks fell, some drowned, some were dragged away. The church doors burst open, gold chalices and relics were snatched from their sacred places, blood pooled at the altar, bodies trampled. A Northumbrian scholar, Alcuin, cried out, "Never before such terror in Britain, the heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God." Aye, a lot of blood was spilt that day. It was the first clear mark of the Viking age. But Lindisfarne didn't fall by chance. The Norse had been getting ready. By the late 8th century, the ships were fast and long and shallow-keeled. They sailed across open sea or up narrow rivers. They didn't need roads, and most certainly, they didn't need permission. One night they were mist, the next they heard fire. And while the monks had prayers, the fearsome Norse had blades. However, no one knows the name of the man who led them. But still, this raid was part of something larger. The Irish Sea, the coast of Francia. They'd been testing the edges. And now, they struck at the heart. The fall of Lindisfarne was a message that openly proclaimed the Norse had mastered the sea, and they were coming for more. Verily, the Lindisfarne terror shook Christian Europe. Omens had come, sheets of light flashing across the sky, dragons of flame winging through clouds. People gossiped. This was God's warning. But again, when the longships made into shore, no prayer could hold them back, and ever since, the raids only grew. By 875, the surviving monks fled. They took St. Cuthbert's relics and disappeared under Norse violence. And then came the year 794. The Vikings hit Jarrow on the River Wear. Simeon of Durham recorded it. The above-mentioned pagans, devastating the harbour of Eckefrid, plundered the monastery at the mouth of the River Don. But St. Cuthbert did not let them leave without punishment. Indeed, their leader was killed by a cruel death by the English. And after a short time, the strength of a storm battered, destroyed, and pounded their ships, and the sea covered very many. So, some of them were cast onto the shore and killed without pity, and these things rightly befell them, since not injuring themselves, they injured others greatly. And so, they thought they could take by steel, but the sea answered with fury. And mind you, these weren't great armies. No, they were just small packs of Norwegian raiders testing the edges of the land. They strike quickly and brutally, and then they're gone with the tide. And then, for a while, they stopped. That raid in 794 would be the last major strike on England for near 40 years. Afterward, the Norse turned their hunger west. And so, in 795, they came to Iona. The abbey stood on an island off Scotland's coast. It was peaceful and isolated, easy prey. Then they hit Christendom again in 802, then in 806. In this raid, 68 monks died that day. They were dragged to the shore and cut down while their killers made off with the church's gold. As for the survivors, they fled. They left Iona behind and ran to Kells in Ireland. Their dream of safety shattered. That same year, the annals of Ulster spoke of flames on Irish shores. The burning of Rishru, it said. Lambay, or maybe Rathlin Island. Either way, the heathens had come. By 795, the Norse tide rolled into Ireland in full force, just as it had swept through the north. They struck the Lonely Islands first. Those were quiet places too, holy places. And even there, the Vikings made them graves. The ground around Antrim in the north and Galway in the west holds the first trace of Vikings in Ireland. Today, their pagan graves show up clearly, buried with tools of war and tokens of life. These belong to the first generations of Norse who came here. And in a man's grave you find swords, spearheads, and shields. In a woman's, you find her ornaments. Oval brooches that speak of home. Aye, these are the remains of a people fresh from Scandinavia. Kilmainham in Dublin holds one of the largest Viking cemeteries outside their land. By the late 10th century, these Norse in Ireland had taken up the Christian faith around them. But long before then, the year of 795 marked the beginning of the Irish raids. Inishmurray in Sligo and Inishbofin in Galway felt the blow that same year. Soon the raids grew more frequent. Viking ships sailed up the Shannon, the Boyne, the Liffey, and the Erne, and in 798 they struck Brega. In 807 they hit Connaught's coast. Historians report that the Norse disrupted a golden age of Christian Irish culture, for they brought 2 centuries of war as they kept plundering monasteries and towns again and again. You see, most of these Vikings came from the western fjords of Norway. They sailed via Shetland, then Orkney, and then down Scotland's Atlantic coast. Then they crossed to Ireland. Some even reached the Skellig Islands off County Kerry's coast. However, for about 20 years, they struck the coasts only. Again, their attacks were hit and run. They left no mark of winter camps in Ireland. Always. They came without warning and they took what they could. Goods, slaves, and ransom. And then they fled back to their bases in Scandinavia or Britain. And those they captured were sent on long journeys. Some went from Dublin to Al-Andalus in Iberia. Others passed through Hedeby or Brennö, then down the Volga to Russia. From there they crossed into Muslim lands and traded for Arab silver and silk. Silver dirhams eventually turned up in Birka, Wolin, and even in Dublin. The trade route bent through Khazar lands, then through Volga, Bulgaria, then caravanned to Khwarezm, then onto Samanid markets, and then finally to the Abbasid heartlands in Mesopotamia. Aye, this first furious phase ran from 795 until 813. Then came a quiet gap of 8 years. Then, in the first decade of the 9th century, the raiders returned. They began striking Ireland's coasts in earnest once more. Their next raid would be in the year 821. The annals of Ulster say they struck Howth and took many women captive. However, that year the pattern began to change. You see, the war bands grew larger and more organized, and no longer did they strike and vanish. Oh, now they came inland, they hit deeper, they stayed longer. And so, this was the second wave. But these raiders weren't just sailing out from Norway. Many came from Leithland. Likely the Norse-held isles north of Britain. The leaders were still freebooters, fighting for themselves, not for any crown. And Leithland was no kingdom yet. That came later, sometime in the 830s, when the raids turned into campaigns. In 833, Norse ships rowed up the Liffey and struck the monastery at Clondalkin. But then, after that, for over a dozen years, the raids looked more and more like a war to claim the island. The Irish sources speak of a war chief, Turgesius or Turgeis or Turges. This Viking seemed to lead this effort on behalf of a king in Leithlind. However, no tales of Turgesius come from Norway, for he lives only in the memory of Ireland and Britain. Gerald of Wales called him one of the first Viking conquerors of this land. Some said he arrived as early as 820, but most agree his real power began around 837. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelander, wrote that Thorgils was a son of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first king. But Harald was born around 851, so the dates don't match. Either way, whoever Turgesius was, his name still stirs debate. You know, some think he was really Ragnar Lodbrok in another form. After all, Saxo Grammaticus tells of Ragnar raiding Ireland and killing a king named Melbricus. So, that might line up with the Norse abduction of King Maelbreit of Kunai Muirthemne in 831. But what we do know is this. Between 832 and 845, Turgesius left a long shadow. Churches were burned, monasteries fell, Norse settlements rose. Dublin itself was said to have been founded during his time in 841. The Irish annals call him ruler of the north, Leth Quinn, Con's half. Snorri claims Thorgils ruled from Dublin for a long while. But the annals of Ulster only speak of Turgeis at Loughree in 845. Maybe he was a warlord, maybe a legend grown too large. Later scribes, however, may have dressed him in stories that weren't his, and he may have had no hand in founding Dublin at all. But his name held weight, and for a time, furor. In the year 835, the Norse struck southern England for the first time. They raided the Isle of Sheppey. It was a small patch of land off the Kent coast. Its monasteries sat close to the shore, so it was easy prey. And the Danes would return to it again and again. Two years later, in 837, 60 longships rowed up the River Liffey. They hit churches, forts, homes, likely even Dublin itself. And that same year, a war leader named Saxolby, or Suxulfur in the Norse tongue, he was cut down in Brega by the Ui Colgain, kin of the Cheyanachta Breg. Unlike what has been said previously, the Irish chronicles also say this was the year the Danes first took hold of Dublin. But either way, that was only the beginning. In 839, a great Norse fleet came by way of the River Tay and the River Erne. Yet, they didn't stop at the coast. They pushed deep into Pictish land, right into the heart of Fortriu. And that year, the Battle of 839 was fought. Some call it the Disaster of 839. Others call it the Picts' last stand. You see, at that time, two kingdoms ruled the north, Pictland and Dalriata. And although Viking ships had haunted their shores before, no battle had been recorded between these Norse and the northern kings. At least not until now. We don't know much about the fight. Only one record survives in the annals of Ulster. It says this: the heathens won a battle over the men of Fortriu, and Uwen son of Onuist, and Bran son of Onuist, and Aed son of Boanta, and others almost innumerable fell there. 3 nobles were named among the dead, countless more unnamed, The dead lay across the field. The size of their loss speaks to a hard-fought campaign. Owain had time to gather a force, and Aed, a Dalriatan king, fought beside him, bound perhaps by oath. It also shows that Dalriata now stood beneath Pictish rule. But it was all for nothing, for the battle broke them. That fight shattered the old Pictish kingdom. The ruling line, steady for over 100 years since the time of Oengus MacFergusa, was torn out by the roots. And what came after would be different. Nevertheless, out of that wreck rose Sinead Mac Ailpin, or Kenneth MacAlpin. He would go on to rule both Picts and Scots, but it began there in 839, with that final blow from the sea. From 840, the Vikings began building fortified encampments. Long forts they were called, and they built them on Ireland's coast. In these they stayed through winters. The first long fort rose at Dublin and at Linduachile. Thanks to long forts, their raids grew in size and in danger, reaching deep inland. They struck larger monastic settlements at Armagh, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Kells and Kildare. They even plundered the ancient tombs of Brú na Bóinne. Their chief Thorgest rode through the Midlands until his dying breath. By the mid-9th century, hard men from the north had settled in Shetland, Orkney, the Nordreijar, the Hebrides and Isle of Man, the Sudreijar, and parts of mainland Scotland, and these Norse did not stay apart. They began to blend with the Gaelic folk in the Hebrides, and on man, they lived under jarls, or captains of ships, and these jarls ruled each hold. For instance, over Orkney and Shetland stood a jarl claiming supremacy over all. In 845, the Vikings struck Dunmask, the rock of Dunamace in County Lowis, and there they killed the abbot of Tírdaglas at Terreglas, alongside other churchmen. That same year, religious sites at Kildare, Clonanoch, Kinnity, Killy, Kells, Monaster Boise, Duleek swords, and Finglas fell under their blades. They even camped near Tullamore that year. Also in 845, Turgesius met his end. Mael Secnail, who was king of Maide at the time, caught him and drowned him in Loch Ware, or Love Owl as others call it, near Mullingar. Some say Turgesius died in 843 or 844, but all agree his fate lay in those cold waters. And the locals say Mael Secnail once served under Turgesius. The tale goes that he sought his advice when a swarm of birds began to tear up the land. Without pause, Turgesius told him to destroy their nests. And that was all Mael Secnail needed. He took the lesson to heart and turned it against the Norse. Another story says Turgesius asked for Mael Secnail's daughter in marriage, and so, pretending to agree, the king sent 12 beardless youths in her place, dressed as maidens. But they were no servants at all, nay, they were sent to kill. Geoffrey Keating, writing in the 17th century, tells it this way. Mael Secnail stood nearby with a troop of warriors. He told the disguised youths to strike once Turgesius laid hands on the girl. Another group was to seize the weapons in the hall, and at the first shout, he himself would storm in and finish the work. So the girl and her false ladies slipped in through the back door and came before Turgesius. He looked them over, and only the girl pleased him. He reached for her, and in that moment, the youths rushed forward. One group took Turgesius alive, The rest grabbed the weapons and held the room. Then Mael-Secnail's men burst in. They cut down every Norseman in the stronghold, lords and underlings alike, leaving only Turgesius breathing. Then they took him to Mael-Secnail's stronghold and held him there for a time. Whatever power Turgesius held, his fall marked a big change in the region, and from then on, the tide began to turn. This phase of blood and fire is known in the old tongue as Cogad Gaidal Re Galaib, the War of the Irish with the foreigners. In the year 847, Gerbal MacDunlainch, king of Osrage, met the Norse of Dublin at Cornbramit and broke them. Their leader, Agnon, known to some as Hakon, fell in the fight. The year after brought heavier blows. Mael-Secnail struck them again at Farrow, near Mullingar. That same year, Tomrere, heir to the king of Leithlind, died in battle. He fell to Olchobar MacTinaida, king of Munster, and Lorcan MacKellag, king of Leinster, at Sayath Nechtain, near Castledermot. Not far off, in an oakwood at Desert Do Chonna, Tigernack MacFocartai, king of Loch Gabhair, smashed another Norse force. Aye, it came to a head in the year 849. The Irish struck at Dublin itself. Mael-Secnail, now High King, and Tigernack MacFocartai led the blow. They plundered the settlement, tore it down, and left it broken. For a time, at least. But that same year, the sea answered. A fleet of 140 longships swept into Dublin. They flew the banner of the king of the foreigners. They had one objective in mind: to bring the old settlers under heel and to force the ones who came before them to bend the knee. And after that, they spread chaos across the land, stirring every shore into unrest. Now, some say the king of Leithlind sent them to reclaim lost ground. Or maybe he smelled blood and moved to profit from the ruin of his kin. But then, come the next year, the Norse joined hands with Sinaed MacConnaing, king of North Brega, and together they struck back. They ravaged through the lands of Mael-Secnail and Tigernack. They burned Tigernack's Crannog at Lagore. If this was revenge for Dublin's fall, then that fleet the year before. Then it came with purpose. In 850, the Vikings spent their first winter in England, hunched on the island of Thanet, off Kent's coast. That was new, for they didn't sail off when the cold came. Then, in 851, the game changed again. And this time, it involved two rival groups. First, there was the Dubgenti. They came to Athcliath. They swarmed through the Fine Gael, cut them down in great numbers, and then plundered their camp. Men, goods, all of it taken. This was something different. Now, the Dubgail or Dubgenti. They were dark foreigners, and they stepped onto Irish soil. No one agrees where they came from. Some say Danish, others say Anglo-Danish. But what's clear is they came hunting, and they found their mark. Then there's the other rival group, the Findgael, fair foreigners, and they were routed, and so Dublin fell to fire again. That same year, the Dubgail marched north to Lind Duachile, near Anagasson. They stormed the Long Fort and slaughtered the Fine Gael there too. But then the next year brought more blood. At Snam Aignach, which is now called Carlingford Lough, the Dubgail struck the Fine Gael once more. And they won. Leading the Fine Gael were two men, Stein or Zain, and Eirkne, who was also known as Jarnkne, or Iron Knee. They ruled together, Eirkne, however, died in that fight. Yet his sons lived on. We hear of them in Dublin in the years 883 and 886. And the man who led the Dobgail was named Horm, or maybe Ormar. And his luck ran out in 856, when Rhodri the Great, king of Gwynedd, killed him. Later that same year, the Norse met hard ground again. The Tianachta Breg bested them twice in a single month, once at Inch near Balrottery, and again at Raith Aldain in County Meath. Aye, the winds had changed in Ireland. The old balance was breaking. In the year 853, a warlord came to Dublin. His name was Amlaib, or Olafur in the old tongue. He made himself king, the first the young settlement had ever known. The Norse gave him hostages, the Irish paid him tribute, and he ruled by right of force. The annals of Ulster call him son of the king of Leithlind. That points to Gottfried, the king across the sea. It's likely Amlaib led the Findgail and had come to drive the Dubgail back. Now, some say Amlaib was the same man as Olafur in Haviti, or Olaf the White, son of Ingjald Helgason, blood kin to Halfdan Whitelegs of Vestfold and to Ragnar Lodbrok himself. Others say he was Olafur Gudrudarsson, son of Gudrud the Hunter. But like so many names from that time, truth and tale blur. However, most agree he was Amlaoib Konung, Olafur Konungur, Olaf the King, the man in the old Irish annals. Anyhow, the next year, in 854, Mael Sechnal tried to strike a bargain with him. But Amlaib was not one to yield. He stood alone at the head of the Norse in Dublin, over both Findgail and Dubgail. And once his hold was firm, he sailed for Britain and fought in many wars. He returned in 856, or maybe 57, and he didn't come alone. Two brothers stood with him, Imar and Awisla. Imar, they say, may have been Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lodbrok. The sagas name him that way, but the Irish give a different line, one written down much later. Now, some said all three, Amlaib, Imar and Awisla, were sons of Gofraid mac Ragnail, king of Leithlind. And in that same year, trouble brewed again. Amlaib clashed with Mael Secnail, who had gathered warriors called the Gal Goidil, men of mixed Norse and Gaelic blood, fighters with no true home. Also, two holy places in Brega Slain and Lusk were sacked that year. The records don't name who did it, but all signs point to the Norse of Dublin. In 857, the fight moved south to Munster. There, Amlaib and Imar faced Keitil Find and Isgal Goidel. They broke them. The next year, Imar and Terbal mac Dunlaing defeated the Kenelfiachach and the Galgoidil at Aratire. Aye, the old order was cracking, and the Norse were deep in the struggle. In the year 859, the king of Munster, Mael Gwale, fell into the hands of the Dublin Norse. They killed him, not in war, but in sacrifice. Some say he was stoned to death. However, it happened, his blood marked the end, at least for a time, of the pact between Sirbal mac Dunlange and the Norse raiders. The years that followed were bitter and restless. No side held ground for long. Alliances changed like mist on the sea. One day brother, the next day foe. Sirbal threw his weight behind his new overking, Mael Secnail, while Amlaib and Imar took up with one of Mael Secnail's rivals, Aed Findleath of Ailech. In the year 861, Aed and the Dublin Norse swept through Maelsec Niall's lands in Mide, burning and taking what they could. But they met resistance. Maelsec Niall turned them back at Drumamui, near the River Figail, on the edge of what we now call Offaly and Kildare. The next year, in 862, they came again, Aed, Flann and the Norse. They raged through Mide, but fate had its own plan. That November, Maelsec Niall died, and with him the campaign lost its breath. Aed Findliath rose as High King, and Mide was torn in two, split between Lorcan MacCathail and Conchobar MacDonchada, both claiming the throne. With Aed's rise came more changing ties. The Dublin Norse now stood with Lorcan, and in 863 they marched with him, Amlaib, Ymar, Awisle, into the lands of Brega. There they did something unheard of. They looted the ancient tombs of the Boyne Valley. These were sacred places left untouched for generations. And in that same year, the king of Leinster, Muirekan MacDiarmata, was killed by Norse hands. So Amlaib and his warriors must have pushed south of the Liffey as well. But by the next year the winds had turned again. Aed Findliath seized Lorcan and had him blinded, while Amlaib drowned Conchobar, his own co-ruler at Clonard, holy ground in Meath. And far to the east, another tale stirred. In the year 865, the Norse sagas say, the great warrior Ragnar Lodbrok was captured by King Ellar of Northumbria. Ellar, cruel as winter, cast him into a pit of snakes. Ragnar's sons, enraged beyond reason, raised a host, the Great Heathen Army. Then they crossed the sea to England, and in that same year they landed in East Anglia. From 865 to 869, Ymar and a kinsman, Halfdan, are said to have joined that army. The English called the Norse leaders Ingvar and Uba. Many believe Ingvari was Ymar. However, Uba's name has no certain match. The chronicler Ethelwerd wrote that the fleet came from the north and wintered in East Anglia. Some say they sailed from Leithlind. The English called them Danes. But others say they were the same Vikings who had harassed the shores of Frankish lands from 845 to 865. Wherever they came from, they brought fire and steel, and the land remembered their passing. In the year 866, Aed Findliath, High King of Ireland and Lord of Ailech, struck hard against the Norse in the north. He burned every long fort they had built. Not one was spared. After that, the Norse never held ground in that region again. That same year, the Dublin Norse turned their eyes across the sea. Amlaib and Awisle crossed to Scotland and raided Fortriu, the land of the Picts. They came back to Dublin heavy with plunder and hostages, but the bond between brothers frayed. The next year they quarrelled over one of Amlaib's wives, and Awisle paid with his life. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Great Heathen Army was moving. They used East Anglia as their base. The local rulers made peace the old way, by handing over horses. The Vikings wintered there, waiting for the right moment. Then, toward the end of 866, they rode north and tried to take York. And so, on the 21st of March, 867, the Battle of York began. The Norse faced the Northumbrians inside the old Roman city. York had once been the seat of empire, then the capital of Northumbria. But now it was torn by civil war. Two men, Ella and Osbert, fought over the crown, and that strife gave the Norse an opening. And so Ubar and Ivar led the army that stormed the city. However, in the spring, Ella and Osbert set their feud aside and joined forces to take the city back. They made it through the gates, but they didn't make it out. Both men fell, and the Norse held the walls. And with victory in hand, the Norse set up a puppet king named Ecgbert. In time, this would become the Norse kingdom of Jorvik, with York as its heart. That same year, the Northumbrians paid Danegeld to buy some peace. And not that further away, the Great Norse Army moved south and took Nottingham, deep in Mercian land. The King of Mercia called on Wessex for aid, and so their armies joined and laid siege to the city. But the siege dragged on with no clear end, and in the end the Mercians paid the Norse to leave. In the autumn of 868, the Norse went back to Northumbria and wintered in York. And by the end of 869, they moved south again to East Anglia and made camp in Thetford for the cold season. But there was no peace in that place. Edmund, King of East Anglia, struck at them without a truce. However, the battle went against him, for he was taken. Some say he was tortured, then killed, and later the people would name him a martyr. But in that moment, his kingdom fell, and the Norse stood unchallenged. In the year 870, our stories bring us to the fortress raised atop the Rock of the Clyde. The Britons of the Old North, those who dwelt near the Firth of Clyde, held Altclut as their stronghold. Kings Amlaib and Imar brought their ships and their strength to lay siege upon it. They pressed the walls for 4 months, and when the well went dry, the fortress gave way. The Vikings carried off a massive prey of British, Pictish, and English captives to Ireland. Among them may have been King Arthgal, Ap Dyfnwal, and his kin. Yet, the following year, Arthgal fell under uncertain skies. With the fall of Altclut, the kingdom turned a new page. The name changed to Strathclyde, and the seat of power moved upriver some 12 miles, to where Govan and Partick lie now within the tail of modern Glasgow. That kingdom lasted as a force for another century and a half. Around this same land, once the northern reach of Northumbria, the Angles never reclaimed what they had lost to Viking sword and settlement. These raids and conquests forged new bonds among Gaelic, Pictish, British, and English alike. And over the course of 3 centuries, these bonds would form together the Kingdom of Alba, and at last, the Greater Kingdom of Scotland. In the meantime, however, the Viking Age would be long and fierce, and it would run its course through Scotland's veins for another 100 years. And then came the Great Summer Army in 871. They came in force under Bagsecki from the lands of Scandinavia. Their eyes were set on Wessex. King Ethelred's brother, Alfred, rallied the West Saxons and met the Vikings on the 8th day of January. What happened was, the Vikings struck first at dawn atop the ridge. They split their ranks, Kings Bagsec and Halfdan to one flank, and their earls to the other. The Saxon scouts told Ethelred and Alfred how the enemy formed, so they matched the formation. Ethelred faced the kings, and Alfred faced the earls. Ethelred slipped to his tent for morning mass. Alfred, left to watch the ridge, could see the Danish wall of shields. Yet he risked all. He led his men upward, shield upon shield, and struck hard at the thorn tree that marked the field. The clash was brutal. But in that moment, the West Saxons won the day. Though the old scribes, both the Chronicle and Asser, laid praise heavy on Alfred for the victory at Ashdown, while others saw it plainly. However, it may have been Ethelred's charge that turned the tide. For when he joined the fight, he struck with surprise and force. So that may have been his plan all along. The Viking dead were many. Bagsec, their king, fell. 5 of their earls too. Sidroc the Old, Sidroc the Younger, Osbern, Freyner, and Harold. The West Saxons chased them until night swallowed the sun, cutting them down as they fled. But victory doesn't always last. Not long after, the Saxons tasted defeat, first at Basing, then again at Meriton, and Ethelred didn't see the year out. He died not long after Easter, which came on the 15th of April. His brother Alfred took the crown, and to hold the peace, he paid the Vikings to buy time. The so-called Great Heathen Army, as the Saxons call them, were blooded and heavy with silver. They wintered through the cold of 871 to 72 in London. Then they turned back to Northumbria, where trouble had risen. You see, the puppet king they left behind had lost control, so they returned to restore their hold over the place. The next winter, they made their camp at Torksey, in the old kingdom of Lindsey, which is now called Lincolnshire. The Mercians, worn thin, paid them again to keep the sword at bay. But peace was never more than a pause. At the close of 873, the Vikings moved to Repton, in the heart of Derbyshire. From there, in 874, they struck deep. They cast out the Mercian king and claimed the land for their own. Then they put a man named Ceolwulf on the throne, a king in name only, held up by Viking hands. Asser tells us then the army broke in two, and that Halfdan took his share north into Northumbria. There by the River Tyne they wintered. As for the other half, which was led by Guthrum, Ossatel, and Anwend, they made for Cambridge and settled in for the cold of 874 to 75. Then, when the frost broke, they marched to Wareham. And there, they raided the land, took a stronghold, and forced Alfred into a treaty to buy them off again. But again, the sword doesn't sleep long. The Vikings left Wareham only to strike elsewhere in Wessex, and at first, their luck held. That same year, in so far north, King Harold Fairhair of Norway took to sea. He meant to bind Norway under one crown. Many who stood against him had already fled, hiding in the isles, raiding from afar, even turning their blades against Norway itself. Harold, however, raised a fleet, found them, and broke their power, and those who were not slain fled west, many to Iceland. So Harold claimed not just Norway, but the Isles, Man, and a section of the Scottish coast. Aye, the rebels were scattered, but the Jarls bent the knee, and Harold ruled more than he had set out to claim. Aye, in the year 876, King Harold came south again, crossing the border with his war-worn men. He carved up the land of Northumbria and gave it to them, piece by piece. They worked the soil with their own hands, ploughed it deep, and made their living from it. That land became part of what we would call the Danelaw. But not all was quiet. That same year, across the Western Sea, the Norse Gaels of Man and the Hebrides rose up. They turned their backs on Harold Fairhair, and so he sent a fleet to put them back in place, with Ketil Flatnose at the helm. Ketil struck hard and held power fast, and for that he was to rule the Southern Isles, the Sudris, as Harold's man. But things change. You see, Ketil's grandson, Thorstein the Red, rode north with Sigurd the Mighty, the Jarl of Orkney. They stormed through Scotland, made lords bow their heads, and took tribute from near half the kingdom. But bold men die bold deaths. Both fell in battle. After them, Ketil named himself King of the Isles. It didn't last, however. Branded an outlaw, with silver promised for his head, Ketil fled. He went to Iceland far from Harald's reach. And there's more. In around 875 or 76, part of the Great Viking Army returned. Halfdan Ragnarsson led them. They came back to York and took it. The people called him King of Northumbria, but the truth is he ruled only the southern half. Deira. And as mentioned earlier, people now began to call it the Kingdom of York, Jorvik. And Halfdan was the first to sit the throne there, but his crown brought no peace. In 877, Halfdan went to claim Dublin, his father's old hold. However, he fell there when trying to take it. The tide turned after that. In 878, Alfred struck back. At Edington, he stood with whatever number of men he had left. You see, after the rout at Chippenham, his army scattered, and so he had no hope of storming a stronghold. However, the Danes knew how to hold a wall. We'd seen it before, back at Reading in 871, and after Chippenham, Alfred vanished from sight. But when he surfaced again, it was Eastertide. He raised a fort in the marsh at Athelney, hidden from the enemy. Then, in the 7th week after Easter, sometime between the 4th and the 7th of May, he called his levy to Egbert's Stone. The men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire came. Also, those who hadn't fled gathered around him. The next day, they marched to Iley Oak. Guthrum's host waited just 7 miles off. The day after that, they pressed on to Edington. There, between the 6th and 12th of May, they met the Danes in battle. The old tale proclaims they fought fierce and close, shoulder to shoulder behind their shield wall, against the whole pagan host. Long and hard they held the line, and at last, Alfred won. The Danes broke, cut down and scattered. He chased the stragglers back to their fortress at Chippenham, cutting them down as they ran. After the fight at Edington, the Danes ran for shelter behind the walls at Chippenham. The West Saxons followed close and laid siege. They waited 2 weeks, holding the line, cutting off all escape. In time, the Danes came out under flag of peace. They offered hostages and swore oaths to Alfred. They promised to leave the kingdom. Even Guthrum, their leader, gave his word that he would take baptism. Aye, this was not like the pacts made before at Wareham and Exeter. Those had been half measures, born of old fights and broken trust. But this time, Alfred had beaten them clean. He held the line and he won, so the promises rang louder, and this time they seemed likely to hold. but some say Alfred won because his force was larger. Even one shire's men could swing a battle, as Devon showed when they broke Ubba's army at Sinwit that same year. Also, Guthrum by that time had lost strong allies. For instance, Ivar the Boneless was gone. Ubba had fallen. Other Danish bands had already taken land in East Anglia and Mercia, and some never made it. Over 120 ships got lost in a storm off Swanage the year before. Verily, the Danes were unraveling from within. Their lords pulled in different directions. They needed time to gather their strength again. But they wasted it. Guthrum's loss at Edington may have come not only from swords and spears, but also from the cracks already splitting his ranks. 3 weeks later, Guthrum stood at the font in Aller, Somerset, and Alfred stood beside him as godfather. The Dane took the Christian name Athelstan, the same name as Alfred's elder brother, who was long dead by now. Now, maybe Alfred believed that baptism would bind Guthrum by oath and spirit, and hold him to the peace by more than fear. Nevertheless, under the Treaty of Wedmore, Guthrum was to leave Wessex and return to East Anglia. And so he did. But as always, trouble was never far. That same year, 878, another Viking host gathered at Fulham, where the Thames meets the tide. Perhaps they heard of Guthrum's defeat and lost heart. Or perhaps they saw weakness abroad. In 879, the host that had once camped at Chippenham moved out. They went to Cirencester, deep in Mercia, and they stayed the year. Then they marched on to East Anglia and made it theirs. And so, Viking power took root there. Meanwhile, Alfred, who was now freed from the threat in his own land, began to rebuild. He reshaped Wessex. He made it strong. He built strongholds which they called burhs. Many were raised from the bones of old Roman towns, with their stone walls rebuilt and made stronger than before. These burhs were placed close together, so no man lived more than 24 kilometers from safety. Each burh was tied to the others by roads made for war, or hare paths as they called them. Now these were paths made for battle, roads that were meant to move men fast when the enemy came, and the word hare meant a raiding host. So, a hare path was a road for marching against that host. Alfred also called the Fyrd, or the old militia, into new order. He saw what must be done and did not wait. And so, to keep the burhs strong, Alfred set a levy on the land. He taxed the folk and set rules for service. The details were written down in what we now call the Burghall Heidich. Some say each burh held horsemen, ready to ride out and meet the Norse before they could dig in. And from the numbers we have, it seems a fifth of Wessex's fighting men, some 27,000, stood ready when called. Meanwhile, the Norse still had a trick they used often. You see, they would often seize a strong place, like a fort or a hill, and from there they would strike out and raid the land around. But Alfred's burhs stopped them cold. From the year 884, they found Wessex harder ground to hold. And still, that same year, another Viking force sailed up the Thames and spent the winter at Fulham. Asser tells us that they came again and again in the years that followed, clashing with Alfred's men. However, they did not break Wessex. Not again. Throughout the years of the 800s and 80s, the Northmen pressed hard on the land. Their longships kept flooding the rivers and shores of Alfred's kingdom, and the king saw what must be done. And so he turned his eye to the sea. He knew that to match the Vikings he would need ships of his own. Bigger, stronger ships. Ships that were built for battle. So he ordered new ships made. Some were said to be twice the length of the Viking keels, with 60 oars or more pulling each one through the water. But it was not only at sea that Alfred prepared. He turned to the land as well. He saw that the old way, calling the freemen to arms when danger came, was too slow. The Norse came fast, and they struck hard. And then they were gone before the call to gather could be heard. So, aside from the fortifications and burhs that we mentioned earlier, Alfred changed the way of war. He made a standing army. An army that's always ready. An army that's always near. In the year 885, the monk Asa wrote that the Viking host in East Anglia broke the peace in a bold and defiant way. Guthrum's name is not spoken, but the message is clear. The truce meant nothing to the Norse. Then came 892. A great Viking host returned, the same one that had camped at Fulham. Aye, they came back stronger. 250 ships landing at Appledore in Kent. Soon after, 80 more beached at Milton Regis. And from there, the armies poured into Wessex again, raiding and striking. But this time, however, the shield wall held. Alfred's defences, his ships, his burhs, his roads, his standing men, they worked. The Northmen met steel and stone. They made little headway. And so the old ways of Wessex were gone, and Alfred had forged a kingdom that could stand. And stand it did. And they did not come alone this time. No. They brought their wives, their children, their kin. This was no simple raid. This was meant to be a new beginning, a claim on the land. And so, Alfred moved quickly. He placed himself where he could watch both enemy hosts. But more trouble followed. You see, the Norse who had settled earlier in East Anglia and Northumbria broke their word, and they sent 240 ships to join the fight. The Chronicle says they did it against their own pledges. After all, oaths meant little to men who smelled blood. And at some point, Alfred's men took Hastin's family, his wife and sons. The annals say talks began between the two leaders, but not the reason. Some believe the king bargained with the lives of the hostages. But while the words passed between them, the Norse at Appledore broke out. They struck northwest, thinking to outpace pursuit. But they did not count on Edward, Alfred's son. You see, Edward overtook them at Farnham, in Surrey. And there the Norse were beaten and fled to an island on the River Colne near Thorney. But then Edward's men surrounded them, cut off, with no way out. The invaders were forced to bend the knee, and so they fell back to Essex. After another defeat at Benfleet, they regrouped with Hastin's men at Shoebury. Later on, Alfred was on his way to Thorney, riding to support his son, when word reached him of new danger. Apparently, the Danes of East Anglia and Northumbria were laying siege to Exeter and to another burh on the northern coast of Devon. So he turned west at once, and when he came to Exeter, the Danes gave up the siege and fled to their ships. What became of the burh in North Devon is not known. Its fate is lost. Meanwhile, Hastin's force began to move. they marched up the Thames Valley, perhaps to join those who had attacked Exeter. But the folk of the land were ready. A great host gathered against them, drawn from every burh east of the River Parrett, from both sides of Selwood, from north of the Thames and west of the Severn. Even Welsh warbands came to stand with the Saxons. 3 elder men led the host: Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, Ethelhelm of Wiltshire, and Ethelnot of Somerset. Ethelred was Alfred's son-in-law, bound by blood and oath. And so the 2 armies met at Buttington. There the Norse were trapped and pressed hard. Weeks passed. The siege dragged on. With the Norse growing weary from hunger, the battle started turning in favour of the defenders. And when at last they tried to break free, they were met with steel and fury. Welsh and Mercian blades broke the Danish charge. Many Vikings were cut down. Others fled, their spirit broken. Elsewhere in Britannia, other events were transpiring. Wales, for all its hills and hidden valleys, never fell to Norse rule like the East had. But the Vikings still found footholds in the south: St. David's, Haverford West, Gower. The names they left behind: Stockholm, Skomer, Swansea. They still whisper their story. Yet they never bent the mountain kingdoms to their will. Meanwhile, those who fled Alfred at Exeter sailed east along the coast and made for Chichester. It was a burh, guarded by 1,500 men, and it wasn't an easy prize. You see, the townsfolk rose up, drove back the raiders, slew hundreds, and took some of their ships as spoils. Later, the chronicler Ethelwerd, writing nearly 100 winters after, told how Hastein struck out from Benfleet with a heavy hand. He burned and ravaged across Mercian lands, and when he neared the Welsh border, more Danes came from the east and north to join him. But the English were not idle. Ealdorman Ethelhelm rallied horsemen and rode with the Western army under Ethelnoth. Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, brought his force soon after. They pressed the enemy hard. By 896, the Norse knew the tide had turned. Their hopes of breaking Wessex had withered. The heathen army, once so feared, was spent. And so they scattered. Some sailed back to East Anglia or Northumbria. Others left with nothing, stole ships, and made south across the sea to the Seine. Nevertheless, the lands of Britannia lay scarred. The great Viking army had cut deep into England's heart. The north and east lay under Norse hands, but Wessex stood bloodied but unbroken. Alfred had held the line, and those who followed him kept that ground. When Alfred died in the year 899, the crown passed to his son, Edward the Elder. But the path to rule was not smooth. Ethelwold, a rival kinsman, made his move. He seized his father's old hall at Wimborne and tried to claim the throne. Edward answered swiftly. He brought his men, laid a siege to Ethelwold, and forced him to flee under cover of night. Thereafter, Ethelwold rode north to York, and in the year 901, the Danes of Northumbria welcomed him as king. The chronicle says, "He stole away by night and sought the army in Northumbria, and they received him for their king and became obedient to him." But he didn't stay long. 2 winters passed. Then, in 903, he returned south with fire in his heart. He raised a fleet, landed in Essex, and marched into East Anglia. There he found a powerful ally, King Eorik, a Dane, and together they launched a raid into Edward's lands, striking into the Cricklade region. However, Edward struck back. He marched his army east into Danish ground, forcing the invaders to return home and defend what was theirs. And it was Edward's men from Kent who met Ethelwald's host in battle. And in that fight, both Ethelwald and King Eorik fell. Their ambitions died with them. That same year, 902, the Norse were also driven out of Dublin. Their hold on the Irish coast broke apart, just as their hopes in Wessex were burning out. Still, the Danes held much of the north. You see, Northumbria had long since fallen into their hands, but Alfred, in his time, had broken their reach into central England, and now Edward, with the strength of Wessex at his back, pushed forward. He had a strong ally, Sister Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, and together they were a force the Danes had not faced before. And so in the year 909, the combined armies of Wessex and Mercia launched a bold 5-week campaign against the Danes of Northumbria. The Norse burned with anger and sought revenge. They believed Edward's army was tied up with his ships in Kent. They swept into Mercia, raiding deep, down to the Avon and along the Severn, reaching as far as Bridgenorth. But they were not fast enough. The West Saxons and Mercians followed hard. And at Tettenhall, on the 5th day of August, 910, they caught the raiders. The battle was ferocious. The Norse were surrounded and crushed. 3 kings fell that day: Ingvar, Eowils, and Halfdan. And so the Viking power in the north was broken. And from that day on, no army from Northumbria came south to raid for a generation. With the northern threat cut down, the armies of Wessex and Mercia turned their eyes to the Danes who still held the lands further south. And the war moved on. In the year 914, a fresh Viking fleet swept into Waterford harbour, driven by the House of Emar. Ragnar came with ships to Waterford, while Sihtric set foot at Senfuait in Leinster. Aye, the Vikings had returned, and the Uí Mare now led their cause. Over the next 8 years, the Vikings struck, and struck hard they did. They won battles that turned the tide in their favour. They seized Dublin once more and founded towns at Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick. These grew into Ireland's first great settlements and became vital trading hubs. Also, Viking Dublin became the largest slave port in Western Europe. Those settlements fitted into Ireland's myriad kingdoms. As for the Norse, they did not remain strangers for long. They married into Irish families. They took on Irish ways. They became the Norse Gaels. Some Viking kings of Dublin, like Sihtric Caich, Gofraid, Uí Mare, Olaf Guthfrithson, and Olaf Cuaran, also ruled the Isles and York. Sigtryg Silkbeard especially brought change. He patronized artists, supported the church, and launched Ireland's first mint in Dublin. As for the precise timing of Olaf Guthfrithson's, Olaf Cuaran's, and Ragnar's reigns, they were somehow debate among the learned. But we will return to Olaf's ventures in time. For now, in 916, Niall Glundub became High King of the Uí Néill after Flansinna. He pushed into Munster against the Irish king Ragnar, but the conflict yielded no decisive victory. In 917, at Confey, which was also called Sen Fuait. War broke out between the Dublin Vikings and Aughair mac Ailela, king of Leinster. Sitric, grandson of Eamar, brought his fleet to Sen Fuait's border. Ragnar, another grandson, attacked the foreigners at Waterford, and in Munster the foreigners suffered a slaughter at Emly. The Eoganacht and the Ciareish broke them again. Niall Glundub, son of Aed, High King of Ireland, mustered Uí Néill forces from north and south to strike at the Norse in Munster. And on the 22nd of August, at Topar Glethrach in Mag Feimin near Clonmel, the Vikings descended on the same day. Between tierce and midday, the Irish launched their attack. They fought until evening. Around 100 men fell, most of them foreigners. Reinforcements from the foreigners' camp came to aid their own. Faced with Ragnar, king of the Dark Foreigners, leading a sizable host, the Irish force pulled back. But Niall, son of Aed, with a small band, pressed on. By his hand, it is said, God limited the slaughter and spared many lives. Niall held his ground for 20 nights. His camp faced the Vikings. He sent word to the men of Leinster, bidding them to harass the Norse from afar. But Sitric, grandson of Eamar, struck first. At the Battle of Sen Fuait, he broke their lines and scattered them. Over 500 fell, and among the dead was Ugair, son of Ailil, king of Leinster. Mael Morda, son of Muirakan, king of Eastern Life, fell with him. So too did Mael Maedoc, son of Diarmait, a scholar and bishop, and Ugran, son of Geneatig, king of Loas. It is also said that Aughair met his end at the hands of a Norse warrior called Palna Tokesson of Funen, father of the famed Palna Toke. Aye, many nobles and leaders died on that field that day. The annals of the Four Masters speak of 600 Irish dead. After their victory, the Norse plundered Kildare. The chronicles say this of Sitric's return. Then came the great royal fleet of Sitric and the house of Eamar. Sitric, the blind grandson of Eamar, forced a landing at Ath Clyath and made camp there. After the battle, Norse settlers found it like slip. So, Dublin was taken. Again. Ragnar left Ireland the next year, in 1918. That same year he fought the Battle of Corbridge on the banks of the River Tyne in Northumberland. His foes were King Constantine mac Aeda of Scotland and Ealdred of Bamburgh, whom Ragnar had once driven from his lands. And on that field, Norsemen and English fought side by side. The annals of Ulster tell us the Norse split into 4 columns. Jarl Otter may have led one of them. He was Ragnar's longtime ally. However, the Scots destroyed 3 of the columns. But the 4th, hidden behind a hill, struck from ambush. And it was Ragnar who led this force. Now, although the Scots escaped without ruin, the fight gave Ragnar the edge he needed. It was no clear victory, but it let him claim more ground. And by the next year, Ragnar was King of York. With Sitric in Dublin and Ragnar in York, a strong bond formed across the sea. A Dublin-York axis that would shape the fate of both islands for the next 50 years. And between 914 and 922, the Norse built strongholds at Waterford, Cork, Dublin, Wexford, and Limerick. From outposts, they had grown into towns, centres of power and trade, planted deep in Irish soil. Niall Glundub rode south toward Dublin in the autumn of 919 and met Sihtric's warriors at Island Bridge, which they called Ath Cliath in the old tongue. He stood shoulder to shoulder with other kings, Ad Mac Eococain of Ulster, Mael Mitig Mac Flanacane of Brega, Mael Craib Mac Duibsinig of Ergiala, Conchobar Mac Flain of Mide, and Telach Mac Fogarteg of South Brega. They seized courage from the absence of Ragnar, believing they could shatter the hold of the Ui Imaer. The clash came on the 14th of September. Niall's voice rang out before the fight. Whoever wishes for a speckled boss and a sword of wound-dealing pain and a green javelin to strike down the wretched, let him march at first light to Athcliath. Aye, steel rang and shields clashed. The battle turned into a crushing defeat for the Irish. 6 kings fell: Niall Glundub, Aed, Mael Mitig, Mael Craib, Conchobar, and Kellach. Along with them died a member of the southern Ui Nail dynasty and Iramon Maxenetig, chief of Senelmain. And now the Viking grip on Dublin held tight. War did not end. A year later, Sihtric faced Donchadon, brother to Conchobar and new High King, in yet another fierce battle. Still, Dublin stayed under Norse control. In 920, Sihtric left for York and, after Ragnald's death, claimed rulership there in 921. Their kinsman Gofraid took charge in 2048 Dublin, turning his hand to raiding and slaving. But Gofraid showed a change in Norse ways. During a raid on Armagh in 921, he spared the prayer houses and shielded the sick. Aye, this was a treatment unheard of among Norse raiders in the century past. He also led hard campaigns into eastern Ulster from 921 to 927, perhaps seeking to forge a Norse dominion on this side of the sea. However, their advance met Muirchertach MacNiall, son of Niall Glundub. He drove them back with such skill that some called him Hector of the Irish. But it was Donchadon of Clan Cholmain who claimed the title of High King after Niall, and Muirchertach did not become King of Ailech until 938. Still, his victories kept the Norse at bay. When Sihtric died in the year 927, Gofraid crossed the sea to York. He went there hoping to claim the kingship, but King Athelstan was waiting. And so Gofraid was driven out and sent packing. Half a year later, he returned to Dublin, only to find the Vikings of Limerick had taken the city in his absence. He fought hard and took it back. But the struggle between Dublin and Limerick didn't end with him, for it carried on well after his death in 934. 3 years later, in 937, Gofraid's son, Olaf Gutfrithson, raised a great host. He joined forces with Constantine, King of Scotland, and Owain of Strathclyde, and together they set their sights on England. What followed was a battle no one would forget, Brunanburh, and so they marched south through Mercia. But Aethelstan, King of the English, stood ready. The two sides met at Brunanburh in a fight that raged from dawn till dusk. Shield walls cracked, iron rang out, and the fighting did not let up. The English broke the shield wall and cut down the northern host. The poem says they clove the shield wall, hacked the war linden with hammers' leavings. It says the men of the north and the Scots lay dead, spears through shield, weary and still. But all great battles were told this way, so the words, though fierce, were not unique. Nevertheless, the bloodshed kept going until nightfall. Ethelstan's army chased the retreating Norsemen, hacking them down as they fled. The old poem says the Northmen who got bloodied and shamed fled over Dingsmere in nailed ships across deep water to seek out Dublin and their homeland again. It also claims no greater slaughter had come, since the Angles and Saxons came here from the east and seized the country. The annals of Ulster called the battle great, lamentable, and horrible. They said thousands of Norsemen fell. Olaf lost 5 kings and 7 earls. Constantine's kin were cut down, with his own son among the dead. The annals of Clonmacnoise listed many more. Kings, princes, men of high rank. But Ethelstan's men paid in blood as well. 2 of his own cousins, Elfwine and Ethelwine, died there. And as for Olaf, he sailed back to Dublin with the broken remains of his warband. Constantine, on the other hand, escaped to Scotland. And as for Owain's fate, it is not told. Aye, word of Brunanburh spread far and wide. It shows up in over 40 old texts, from Saxon to Norse, Irish to Norman. Some say Ethelstan's victory kept England from breaking apart. Others say it was the day Englishness took shape. But all agree it marked a turning not only for England, but for every land on these isles. Ethelstan merged the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single England. He crushed Viking resistance and their allies. Yet, when he died in the year 939, Olaf Guthfrithson sailed from Dublin and claimed Northumbria with barely a challenge. In York, the coins he struck bore the raven, and in the year 940, his cousin Olaf Cuaran sailed to join him in York. The very next year, Olaf Guthfrithson marched into Mercia and East Anglia. The archbishops of York and Canterbury stepped forward to broker peace. Edmund, son of Ethelstan, and now king, gave up much of the southeast Midlands and Lincolnshire. Olaf Guthfrithson likely died in 942, and Olaf Cuaran took the reins. Then, in 943, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Olaf Cuaran's baptism, with King Edmund as his sponsor. And in that same year, another Norse ruler appeared in Northumbria, Ragnar Guthfrithson. He too was also baptized under Edmund's wing. And although both Olaf's and Ragnar are called king, the chronicle leaves it unclear whether they ruled together or stood as rivals. Meanwhile, Eric Bloodaxe, king of Norway, cast his shadow over Britain. The sagas diverge on how he first reached these shores. The terse histories like Theodoricus tell a simple tale. That Eric fled to England, was welcomed by Ethelstan, ruled briefly, and died soon after. The Historia Norwegia, however, adds that Eric was received by his half-brother Hakon, then baptized, and then he was made ruler of Northumbria by Ethelstan. It also states that his rule turned harsh, and as a result, he was cast out and died on a raid in Spain. Later sagas spin a richer tale. They say Eric wandered as a raider. Then he sailed to Orkney, and there he forced the local jarls into vassalage, gathered a fleet, and launched raids on Ireland, the Hebrides, Scotland, and England. But when Eric finally wore the crown of Northumbria, his place in history was sealed. And as you're already aware, this Northumbria had long stood between the kings of Wessex and the Hiberno Norse, descendants of Ymer of Dublin. Its loyalties changed as the tides, so much so that Henry of Huntingdon judged them traitorous, blaming their usual faithlessness. When Edred took the throne in the year 946, The north still boiled. No one knows for sure what rival kings were planning, but trouble was brewing. And so, Edred struck fast. He forced Northumbria under his rule, and the Scots bent the knee, swearing to follow his will. Then, in the year 947, he summoned Archbishop Wulfstan and the Northumbrian Witan to Tanshelf, where the old Roman road crosses near the Humber. There they pledged their oaths to him, but something was off. You see, the oaths came, but the warmth did not. It seems English rule sat heavy on the north. Soon after, the chronicle tells us, those same Northumbrians broke their word. And by the next year, 948, they had made Eric, son of Harold, their king. And so, Edred answered with fire. He marched north and laid waste to the land. Ripon Minster, raised by St. Wilfrid, was burned. However, as Edred's men turned back south, they were caught and bloodied near Castleford. Still, the message was clear. Stay with Eric, and worse would come. And so the Northumbrians yielded. They cast Eric out and paid for their betrayal. But as you'd expect, the peace didn't last long. Soon after, maybe in 948 or 49, Malcolm, King of Scots and Cumbria, raided into Northumbria. He came south as far as the River Tees, dragging off cattle and captives. Chronicles hint that he may have been acting for Eric, or perhaps for Olaf Seitriksson, but no one knows for sure. And with Eric gone, the road was open for Olaf Kvaran. You see, he had been beaten in Ireland at Slane in 947, and now turned again to Northumbria. He took the kingship, likely in 949. Edred this time did little. Maybe he chose to look the other way. Olaf was his brother's godson, after all. But the tides changed yet again in 952. The Northumbrians threw Olaf out and brought back Eric, son of Harold. The annals of Ulster say that same year, Norse Giles, or the foreigners, won a battle against Scots, Britons of Strathclyde, and Saxons. Whether Eric led them or not, the records don't say. Maybe he did, or maybe he only returned after the storm settled. Either way, his rule did not last. In 954, the Northumbrians turned on him once more and cast him out for good. The final blow came at the Battle of Stainmore. Eric Bloodaxe stood against foes. Maybe Oswulf of Bamberg, maybe Maccus, son of Olaf. Some say Maccus fought for Edred, carrying out the king's will, who often played Norse against Norse to keep their swords off his own men. And so the sword settled the matter. Eric fell, and with him ended the Viking line in Northumbria. But just to honor his name, Eric did not fall without a fight. Aye, he stood at the front, outnumbered and bloodied, but proud. He was flanked by 5 kings from the Hebrides and 2 earls from Orkney. They even say the ground drank a lot of blood that day. Nevertheless, like we said, his death broke the back of Scandinavian York. No more kings. Edred took it and placed Oswulf as earl. And from then on, Northumbria bent the knee to the English crown, ruled not by lords of their own choosing, but by earls serving southern kings. And for a time there, the Norse raids died out. For a while. As for Gunhild, Eric's widow, she gathered her 5 sons and sailed from that cold, bitter land. She went east, back to Jutland, to her brother, Harold Bluetooth. The wind behind her carried the end of an age, Yet not all Norse power died with Eric. You see, the sea kings of the Isles kept their own ways. Half Norse, half Gael. And in the year 973, they joined hands with the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde, bound by threat more than friendship. Meanwhile, in Ireland the tide was also turning. In the year 980, Mael Secnail Mór crushed the Norse of Dublin. He broke them plain and simple. Before that, however, the Irish had little to show in battle. Most looked on the Norse as a scourge, foreign and unwelcome, no matter the blood ties from years of marriage and mingling. Especially in the north and centre, they were hated. However, that began to change a few years earlier in 977, when Brian Boru rose. So he led an attack on the Dublin Norse, and at Tara, the old seat of kings, he showed them the old gods no longer favoured the raiders. Verily, that battle marked a big change. Not the end, but the beginning of it. Now, what happened at Tara was, on one side stood the Norse from Dublin, with fighters from the Hebrides behind them. Their war chief was Ragnar, son of Olaf Cuaran. And across the field was Mael Secnail MacDomnail, and his warriors from Mide, his own land, and likely many more from Leinster and Ulster. Aye, the Norse were shattered, total ruin. The Viking war chief gave up his crown and took himself to Iona, where he died in quiet retreat. As for Mael Secnail, he laid siege to Dublin and the city fell. It gave up gold, slaves, and its claims to Weenale land. And in the years that followed, Dublin stayed in the hands of Mael Secnail and his kin. Aye, Tara crushed the Norse hold on Ireland in a way Clontarf never truly did. That later battle may be more famous, but Tara hurt more. A lot more. Olaf was the last true Norse king of Dublin. After him, the kingdom was only a shadow of what it once was. Over the next 30 winters, Brian Boru did what no Irish king had managed before. He brought the Norse towns under his hand. Limerick, Dublin, Waterford. One by one they bent the knee. Brian broke their hold, not with a single blow, but over years of war and skill. And when the storm settled, Brian cemented himself as High King of all Ireland. Across the sea, the English were changing too. Under King Edgar, they pulled their fractured land together. He ruled from Wessex, but both Saxon and Norse folk called him king. He was known as Edgar the Peaceful, and for a time, peace held. But as you probably guessed, peace never lasts around here. After Edgar died, his son Edward the Martyr took the throne. But he didn't hold it long. He was cut down in the year 978. Then came Ethelred, called the Unready, though it meant more poorly advised than slow of mind. And under him, the strength of the English crown began to decline. And by the year 980, the Norse ships returned. One name from those raids still rings through time: Olaf Tryggvason, a fierce man who would later become King of Norway. He led warriors across the seas in the year 991. Ipswich burned under their sails, and soon after came the battle that stirred every English heart for generations. The Battle of Maldon. Aye, it happened near the Blackwater, beside Maldon in Essex, on the 10th or 11th of August. The English were led by Earl Byrhtnoth, a proud man, brave, maybe too brave. His Thens stood with him against a far larger Norse host, likely 2,000 to 4,000 strong. Some even say Sweyn Forkbeard was there too, fighting alongside Olaf. The battle is remembered in an old poem where men speak before they die, and none turn from the fight. The monks of Ely later wrote that Birtnoth held firm, even though his men were few and the enemy came abundant as storm clouds. Some say the numbers weren't so lopsided, but still, the fight went poorly for the English. Birtnoth fell, and with him, many of his things. And so the Norse won that day. And despite the heavy cost, this was a strong signal. The old peace was broken, and the long raids had begun again. And as for Olaf Tryggvason, his story was only just beginning. Now, at the time, the English crown had no clear way of answering the Norse threat. Some said fight, others said pay. Buy peace, if peace could be bought. But Birtnoth wanted none of that. He was ready to die rather than hand over coin or bride. And the poem reflects that. His words speak of standing ground, not bargaining. What happened was, the Vikings came up the river Blackwater, known back then as the Panta. Then they dropped anchor near a small island in the mouth. Thereafter, Birtnoth gathered his fyrd, comprising local men. Farmers mostly, not warriors by trade. Only his household guards were seasoned. Still they rode to meet the Norse. There he told them to dismount, to send their steeds away and walk into the fight like men. And indeed they would stand shoulder to shoulder on foot. The Viking ships beached at the island. At low tide, a narrow strip of land which might be the Northey Island Causeway, as most believe, rose from the water, linking island to shore. There the first blows were traded avat. 3 Saxon warriors, Wulfstan, Elfheri and Maccus, held the causeway. No Viking passed them easily. Then Olaf sent word. If Birtnoth would give gold and gear, he'd leave without further harm. But Birtnoth answered sharply. We'll pay you with spear tips and sword blades. But when Olaf asked to be allowed onto the mainland for proper battle, Birtnoth, in what the poem calls Ofer mode, which means pride, arrogance, or noble spirit, granted the request. And that was his undoing. Aye, the Vikings crossed and the battle began. It was hard and bloody. And then came the breaking point. A man named Godrach, one of Birtnoth's own, turned coward. He leapt onto the Earl's own horse and fled. His brothers Godwin and Godwig followed. Others saw the horse and believed it was Birtnoth himself running from the fight. And so panic spread. The men broke, and some ran. Now, it mattered little that Birtnoth had once gifted Godricig horses out of trust. The betrayal stung deeper than any flesh wound, and in case you didn't know, in those days, to flee battle after being granted the Lord's favor, especially his horse, was to shame yourself beyond death. Absolute coward, oath-breaker, and that's how he was remembered. Nevertheless, Birtnoth fought to the end, and the Saxons, they held as long as they could, but they were outmatched. Afterward, they found his body headless, but his gold-hilted sword still lay beside him. And that detail mattered, for even in defeat, he hadn't been stripped like prey. Verily, the loss at Malden changed English policy. No longer did they talk of standing and fighting. That same year, they paid the Norse 10,000 Roman pounds of silver, which was over 3,000 kilograms. They paid this just to buy peace. But as you can guess, silver only feeds the fire. Aye, the raids didn't stop. They grew worse, and the payments kept coming, heavier with each passing year. Elsewhere, the Vikings of Dublin and their kin in Leinster rose twice against Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, and twice they met their doom beneath his blade. Their blood stained the fields at Glenmama in the year 999, and at Clontarf in the year 1014. You see, at Glenmama, Brian and Mael Secnail brought their men together. They met the host of Leinster and Dublin on Thursday the 30th of December 999 near Lyons Hill in Kildare. That ground once belonged to the kings of Leinster. There the Munster Meath army crushed the rebels. The sources speak of fierce slaughter on both sides. The annals of Lindisfarne mourned the loss of the best part of the foreigners of Ireland. The Cogard Gaidel Regalib boasted that no battle since Magrath in the 7th century had seen fiercer carnage. They counted among the fallen Harold, son of Amlaib, brother to Sitriok Silkbeard, and noble men of the foreigners, including Quellen, son of Eitigen. On Brian's side, even the Cogad admits that many multitudes of the Dalkais perished. It calls the fight bloody, furious, red, valiant, heroic, manly, rough, cruel, and heartless. O'Corraine would later call it a crushing defeat for Leinster and Dublin. Verily, the revolt lay broken at their feet. Now, tradition says Harald Olafsson, the son of the king of the Danes, fell in the rout and was buried in the quiet graveyard of Cry Helpay. It is also said that Brian took Mael Morda of Leinster captive and held him until hostages were given. Chroniclers claim 7,000 Norse lay dead in the field. In an age when armies numbered no more than 100 or 200, such losses opened the road to Dublin, and so they pressed on without delay. Brian's soldiers reached Dublin on New Year's Eve of 999. They breached the defences with little resistance. Then, on New Year's Day, the calends of January 1000, they burned the town and the sacred grove of Thor across the Liffey. The Cogade tells of the plunder in vivid detail, and that after Brian's men plundered the Norse town, they burned its fortress and then drove out King Sigtryg Silkbeard. Afterward, they raided the Dune, then poured into the market, taking coins, silks, and every treasure in sight. And when Munster's warriors approached, Sitriok fled north to Ulster. His ally, Mael Morda of Wee Fialine, was caught in shame, as the Cogad Gedil Regalaib makes plain. News of those deeds stirred fear across the sea. And as a result, in the year 1002, on St. Brice's Day, King Ethelred of the English gave a brutal command. He ordered all Danes in his realm to be slain. Later on, word reached King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. His sister Gunhilda may have fallen in the slaughter. And so, in anger, he struck back the next year. First, Exeter fell by fire. Then Hampshire, Wiltshire, Wilton, Salisbury, each burned in the Viking vengeance. At the start of these raids, Sweyn made a pact with Duke Richard II of Normandy, granting his warriors right to trade their plunder there. Sweyn's raids surged again in 1004. East Anglia felt the blade. Thetford was laid low. Norwich burned. Alas, famine struck in 1005, pulling Sweyn back home to Denmark. However, the war did not end. In 1006 and again in 7, more raiders crossed the sea. King Sweyn was paid silver, more than £10,000, to sail away. But peace did not hold long. This time, Thorkel the Tall led a new force, and for 3 years his horde swept southern England. In August of 1009, they landed at Sandwich. Then they advanced on Canterbury, but Kent bought them off with £3,000 of silver. Afterward, they tuned toward London and battered at its gates, again and again, but the city held, and so they withdrew. On the 8th of September in the year 1011, Thorkel the Tall brought his army back to Canterbury. They laid siege to the city for 2 weeks. Some say Olaf Haraldsson stood beside him in that fight. Nevertheless, after 3 weeks of hard battle, the Norsemen broke through. The old tales blame a man called Elfmeyr for the fall. He had once been spared by the Archbishop, Elfheia, but now he opened the gate to the enemy. And so the city fell, and Thorkel's men stormed in, took what they pleased, and set fire to the cathedral. They seized Elfheia, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and many others like Bishop Godwine of Rochester, Abbess Leofrun of St. Mildred's, and the King's Reeve, Elfwerd. The Abbot of St. Augustine's, Elfmer, on the other hand, slipped away. The rest, however, were not so lucky. The Archbishop was held for 7 months, and during that time, he tried to sway the pagan Norse to the Christian faith. Some turned, others grew edgy. The Viking army demanded £3,000 of silver for his release. But Elfheia refused. He would not pay his ransom, nor let his people carry the cost. So on the 19th of April, in the year 1012, they killed him. During a drunken feast at Greenwich, they pelted him with ox bones, until one man rose and struck him in the head with the blunt end of an axe. Some say Thorkel tried to stop it, offered all he owned but his ship. And someone, maybe Thorkel himself, carried the body to London the next day. The raids quieted after that, but not for free. The English paid heavy Danegeld, and by the end, it totaled £48,000 of silver. Thorkel and those loyal to him turned away from the war. He took 45 ships and went over to serve King Ethelred. And from that moment, the Norse fought for the English crown. Then, in the year 1013, King Sweyn Forkbeard crossed the sea once more with all his strength. The Peterborough Chronicle tells it plainly. Before August had ended, King Sweyn sailed to Sandwich. From there, he made his way rapidly through East Anglia, then followed the Trent upriver to Gainsborough. Thereafter, Northumbria bent to the knee. So did Lindsay. The 5 boroughs gave hostages. Every shire sent theirs. And when Sweyn saw the whole land yield before him, he gathered horses and supplies. Then he rode south with the bulk of his army. His son, Canute, stayed behind with the rest of the men and the hostages. Verily, the conquest had begun in full. After Canute crossed Watling Street, the army rode to Oxford. The folk there did not fight. They too bent the knee and gave up hostages, as was the way from here on. From there, he turned south to Winchester, and the same thing happened. No blood spilled and no blades drawn. Then he turned his eyes eastward to London, but London held firm. King Ethelred was still in the city, and with him was Thorkel the Tall. Yes, that same Thorkel who had changed sides and now fought for the English king. Together they stood their ground, the gates held, and the walls did not fall. Swine knew better than to waste men on stone, so he turned west to Bath. And there, the Western Thanes met him in peace, gave him their oaths, and handed over hostages. When word of that reached London, the mood changed. They feared what would come next if they stayed proud, so they yielded too before it was too late. In this moment, Ethelred knew the game was lost, and so he sent his sons, Edward and Alfred, across the sea to Normandy. Then he took himself to the Isle of Wight for Yule. Not long after, he followed his sons into exile. And with Ethelred gone, Sweyn set himself up in Gainsborough, in the heart of Lincolnshire. From there, he began to shape the bones of his new kingdom. A kingdom wide, strong, and full of promise. England was his, but the heavens had other plans. Only a handful of weeks passed, 5 no more, before Sweyn was dead. Ethelred came back soon after, and with him came war. Sweyn's son, Canute, was driven out not long after, and the throne changed hands again. Now far to the west, across the sea, another fire burned. On the 23rd day of April in the year 1014, a great battle was fought at Clontarf near Dublin. On one side stood none other than Brian Boru, High King of Ireland. On the other, a fierce alliance, comprising Norse-Irish warriors led by Sigtryg, Silkbeard of Dublin, Mael Mordar of Leinster, and 2 Viking lords from abroad, Sigurd of Orkney and Brodir of Man. The clash began at dawn and lasted till the sun dipped low. In the end, the Norse and their allies broke. Few of them lived to flee. Aye, the dead were many. 7,000, perhaps 10. Most of the leaders fell. Sigurd, Brodir, Mael Morda. Brian's victory was clear, but it came at a bitter price. He was slain in his tent, cut down by stragglers. His son Murshad also died. So did his grandson Toirdalbach. And after Clontarf, the Norse grip on Ireland cracked once more, and the power of Dublin's Vikings never truly recovered. In Ireland, this tale grew into legend, a story of freedom won and foreign rule broken. And Brian became a hero of the people, especially in later days when Ireland stood under new masters. And it is said that from that day forward, the Vikings of Dublin could no longer stand alone against Ireland's strongest kings. In the harvest month of the year 1015, Canute put his ships to sea, 200 longships, packed with 10,000 warriors. They swarmed across the waves toward England. The men came from every corner of Scandinavia, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and others too. Most were fighters for hire, mercenaries, paid in silver and blood, and at the head of the fleet, Canute led them proudly and surely. The Peterborough Chronicle tells us that early in September, Canute landed at Sandwich. From there, he sailed around the Kentish coast, struck into Wessex, and came up the mouth of the River Frome. And then began the burning. Dorset, Wiltshire, and Somerset felt the fury first. Aye, it was a hard campaign. fiercer than anything seen since Alfred's day. Queen Emma's scribes spoke of that fleet. They said the ships glowed with gold and silver, and that the prows were carved with beasts. Lions, bulls, and men, all with shining golden faces. Each ship a threat in itself. Each man aboard chosen not by birth, but by strength. For there were no slaves, no freedmen, no weak, and no old among them. All were seasoned warriors, fast on foot, strong of arm, and bred for war. Even horsemen were slower than they. And for the rest of that year, southern England suffered. Ethelred lay sick at Cosham, too weak to lead, while Canute devastated the land far and wide. More hostages were taken. More nobles bent the knee, some bent for fear, others for gain. 2 English lords, Eadric Striona and Edmund Ironside, gathered armies of their own to stop the Danes. But mistrust ran deep, and though their men stood together, Eadric tried to have Edmund killed. Thus the alliance shattered and the armies split. But then Eadric turned traitor outright. He led 40 ships, once part of the royal fleet, over to Canute's side. And so more English strength was lost. By winter's end, Canute held Wessex. Then he crossed the Thames at Cricklade and marched north into Mercia, burning Warwickshire as he went. Edmund waited with his men in the east, ready to strike. But the Mercians were wary and slow, and they refused to fight without Ethelred and the London host. So the army crumbled without a blade drawn. Still, Edmund would not stop. He took what men remained and rode north to Northumbria. And there he met Uhtred the Bold, his brother by marriage, lord of the northern lands. Together, they struck back at Eadric, raiding his holdings in Staffordshire, Shropshire, and Leicestershire. But while they fought, Canute burned through the east, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, Huntingdonshire, Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and then Northumbria itself. And when the storm came to Uhtred's lands, he made his choice. He left Edmund's cause. Canute had no use for half-hearted oaths. And so, on his order, or so the tale goes, Thurbrand the Hold slew Uhtred. Maybe it was politics, maybe a blood feud. Either way, the axe fell, and with it, another great name vanished into the ground. All the while, Edmund rode south to London. The old king, Ethelred, breathed his last on the 23rd day of April. Word spread quickly, and those nobles still in the city gathered fast. Among them were Alfred of Hampshire and Ulfsheitel Snilling. Men of weight and war, they named Edmund their king. But not all bowed to him. You see, down in Southampton, another council of lords swore fealty to Canute the Dane. Therefore Edmund wasted no time. He turned his horse to Wessex, calling up the feared, the landfolk sworn to fight when danger came. And while he gathered men and blades, the Danes marched on London, and on the 7th day of May, they set siege to the city. They dug deep into the earth south of the Thames, hewing out a wide ditch. Then, dragging their longships through it, they brought them west of the bridge, cutting the flow of the river. They ended up ringing the city in a trench, which then shut off every gate. No one could get in, and no one could get out. Time and again they stormed the walls, but the folk of London beat them back, holding firm on the ramparts. After many days, the Danes pulled back, for now. Then word reached them. Edmund was rousing the Firths of Wessex. So they marched west in haste, hoping to strike before his army was ready. But in the woods of Selwood, the English met them. There the Battle of Penselwood was fought. Sometime between the middle of May and the turning of midsummer, Edmund led the charge. His army broke the Danes near the village and sent them fleeing. Strangely, no tale of this fight survives in the old Norse songs. Soon after came the Battle of Shurston. It happened after midsummer, when the air was hot. Edmund Ironside stood again, this time on the hills around Shurston, facing the might of the Scandinavian host. For this event, the records are thin. But a monk named John of Worcester left his telling. He said Edmund placed his best men at the front and his weaker ones behind, holding the line. Then he walked among the ranks, calling each man by name, reminding them why they fought. For kin, for hearth, for home. And then the horn blew. The West Saxons stepped forward in slow measure, with their spears set. The Danes came on just the same. The clash was savage. Iron on flesh, spear on shield. The English chronicles claim that Edmund himself fought in the thick of it, hand to hand, driving into the fray. And the battle raged for 2 full days. And in the end, the English drove the Danes from the field. Legend says one of their captains, a man called John Rattlebone, was gut-cut in the fight, but he stuffed his insides back in with a stone and kept swinging. It's also said that Thorkel the Tall may have fought for the Danes that day. Anyhow, after the bloodletting, the Scandinavians turned back to London and laid siege once more, and this time Edmund raised a greater host. The people of London held out, stubborn as stone, until their king arrived to lift the siege. 2 days later, the armies met again in the fields at Brentford. It happened in the year 1016, sometime between the middle of June and the fall months that followed. Again, Edmund Ironside led the English. Canute led the Danes. It was a clash born of fury and pressure. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle tells us that he put the Danes to flight and that the victory came at a heavy cost, for many Englishmen died by water and not by sword. 8 they drowned in the Thames, trying to cross too soon, chasing spoils before the main host could catch up. So their greed and eagerness killed them. But then, after the fight, Edmund turned back to Wessex. He needed to recover, raise more men, and prepare for what came next. And as for Canute, although his army was routed, he saw a chance. He circled back and laid siege to London yet again. Except this time, his losses had thinned him. He couldn't break the city, so he turned inland into Mercia and set to plundering instead. It was not long before the two sides clashed again. The Battle of Otford took place near the village of that name in Kent. Edmund struck hard, and the Scandinavians broke once more. The English chased them down toward the Isle of Sheppey, driving them into the marshes and waterlands. Around this time, Edric Streona, the Fox of Mercia, changed his tune once more. He left Canute's side and came crawling back to Edmund. The chronicle says he talked Edmund out of attacking the Danes at Aylesford. But whether that was for peace or treachery, none can say for sure. Then came the final reckoning, Asundun. The battle was fought on the 18th of October, the year still being 1016. Now, some say the battle site was Ashton in the north of Essex. Others swear it was Ashington down in the southeast. But wherever it was, both armies met there. You see, the Danes were retreating to their ships, but the English caught them, and the fight began. Edmund lined his men in 3 ranks. He fought in the front, shoulder to shoulder with his warriors, shouting and swinging. Knut, on the other hand, stayed behind the lines, watching, calculating. And then, betrayal. Edric Streona, the same man who had bent knee to Edmund not long before, turned. Again, he left the field. Some say he pulled his men back before the first blow fell. According to the Encomium Eme Regina, he shouted, "Let us flee and snatch our lives from death, for I know the strength of the Danes." But the same tale hints it was deceit, not fear. A secret pact made with Knut, favor traded for treason. And with Edric gone, the English lines broke. The Danes pressed through and the field was lost. Asandun was a bitter defeat for the Saxons, and the blood of many men soaked that earth. Aye, Edric Streona had already betrayed the English once when he welcomed on his first landing. Then, after the Danes were broken at Otford, he slithered back to Edmund's side, claiming loyalty. But apparently, and now evidently, it was all a trick, for Asandun turned again. Anyhow, in this battle, Edmund's men suffered dearly. Ednoth the Younger, the Bishop of Dorchester-on-Thames, was struck down by Knut's men as he said mass for the soldiers, and according to the Liber Eliensis, they first hacked off his hand to steal a ring, then tore his body to pieces. Ulfkeitel Snilling, one of the fiercest things of the Saxon realm, fell there too. After the defeat, Edmund rode west. However, he would not yield. Meanwhile, Canute followed, pressing into Gloucestershire. And somewhere near the Forest of Dean, the two sides clashed again. But less is known of this fight. Nevertheless, Edmund had Welsh allies with him. And then came the final meeting. On a river island called Olney, south of Deerhurst, Edmund and Canute met face to face. The nobles had pushed for peace. Some say Edmund challenged Canute to single combat. A holmgang, one man against another, but Canute refused. So they made a pact. England would be split in two. Canute would rule all north of the Thames, and Edmund would hold the south, and London with it, and whoever outlived the other would take the whole kingdom. They sealed the peace with oaths and pledges. They became sworn brothers. Canute took Mercia and the north, and Edmund returned to Wessex. The Danes then sailed their ships up to London, took what spoils they could, and settled in for the winter. But as you can imagine, the peace did not last long. Aye, on the 30th of November, just weeks after the pact was made, King Edmund died. Some say his wounds from Asandun never healed, others speak of poison. Adam of Bremen, writing decades later, claimed foul play. William of Malmesbury, writing still later, mentioned a rumour that Edmund was slain while seated on a toilet. We will never know for certain. But what's known is this. They buried Edmund Ironside at Glastonbury, beside his grandfather Edgar. And so, his death left Canute the full crown of England. But the fight Edmund gave him would never be forgotten. After old King Canute died in the year 1035, His empire split. Denmark and England went their own ways again. They stayed apart, mostly. For a short time, from 1040 to 1042, his son Harthur Canute held the English throne, but it didn't last. The grip Canute once held over both lands slipped through his son's fingers like water through cold stone. 100 years later, in the year 1142, the name of Eystein Haraldsson came into the sagas. He was a son of Norway, though he'd been raised across the sea in Scotland. That year, a band of lendmen, men of weight and land, crossed west to fetch him home. They brought him back to rule. Eystein ruled until 1157, and during his reign he did not sit idle. In the early 1150s, he turned his attention back to Scotland. The sagas say he rode out on campaign and seized Harold Maddison, the Earl of Orkney down in Caithness, and made him pay dear to walk free. Then Eystein's ships prowled the Scottish coast, looting as the old raiders once did. Aberdeen fell to him, and while England tore itself apart in the time they called the Anarchy, Eystein struck their shores too, plundering as his forebears had in the days of iron and fire. But of all the Norse kings who tried for England, none was more feared than Harald Hardrada. Aye, this is one name you noticed for sure. You see, in the year 1066, Harold of Norway set sail with 300 longships and 10,000 men. He came to take the English crown. Now, he was no upstart. He had fought across the world, from the rivers of Rus to the walls of Miklagard. And so he landed with purpose, and he met the English at the village of Fulford, just south of York, on the 20th day of September. And the English knew he was coming. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, gathered what forces they could. They set their line between the River Ouse on one side and a stretch of swampy land called Fordland on the other. It gave them a tight hold, but little room to run. So if one flank broke, the whole line would fall, and there was no way back through the marsh. Harold, on the other hand, came from the south, his host moving in 3 waves. He lined his men to meet the English, though he knew not all had yet arrived. The fresh recruits stood on his right, while his best men held the riverbank. The English struck first. They knew they had no time. But before the Norwegians could settle their ranks, Morcar's men charged. They hit Harold's weaker flank and drove them back into the marsh. And for a moment, it looked like they might carry the day. But that moment passed. Harold brought his seasoned fighters into the fray, all fresh and strong. Concurrently, the Saxon line had spent its strength too soon, and the Norwegians crushed them. Aye, the field ran red at Fulford. It was the first great battle of that fateful autumn, and it would not be the last. Afterward, more of Harold's men arrived, still coming up from the rear. Some of them slipped around the thick of the battle and opened a new front, catching the defenders off guard. Aye, it was over. The English were outnumbered, outmatched and outflanked. They broke and the field was lost. But Edwin and Morcar lived. They pulled back through the blood, wounded but breathing. York gave in soon after. They made terms. The Norwegians would not storm the city, and the gates would stay shut. Tostig, Harold's ally and once Earl of Northumbria, may have spared it from the sack. Perhaps he still saw it as his own. The victors, however, demanded hostages, and so a time was set. The Norwegian army then turned east, marching to Stamford Bridge, 7 miles from York, to wait for their prize. Now, on a side note, although we said that Harold brought 10,000 men to England, only 6,000 stood at Fulford. The English, on the other hand, brought 5,000. Aye, the killing was thick indeed. Some say 15 out of every 100 men who entered the fight never left it. That would be over 1,600 dead. The power of Mercia and Northumbria was shattered on that very field. Meanwhile, word of the loss reached King Harold Godwinson. He was in London, and with little time, he marched his army nearly 200 miles north. He did it in less than a week. He caught the Norwegians flat-footed while they were waiting for hostages to be given to them. Verily, Harold's men, basking in their win, were unready. They hadn't expected a fight, not yet at least. They saw no sign of the enemy until the English army was already upon them. But before the clash at Stamford Bridge, a lone rider came out from the Saxon line. He rode straight to where King Harold Hardrada stood with Tostig Godwinson. No name did he give, but he spoke clear and to the point. He looked to Tostig and offered him back his earldom, his lands, his title. If he turned his sword on the Norse, Tostig then asked what his brother Harold would give to the mighty Hardrada for his trouble. The rider answered without pause, 7 feet of English ground, since he's taller than most. Then he turned and rode back to the English host. Hardrada, amused by such boldness, asked Tostig who the man was. Tostig gave him the truth. That was Harold Godwinson himself. Then the storm broke. The English army came on rapid, and the Norse were caught off guard. Their line was strung out, scattered along the way. The bridge stood narrow, and the English had to cross it to bring their full strength to bear. One Norseman stood there, just one, and he held away. They say he had a Dane axe and the fury of the old gods in him. He held that crossing alone, cutting down man after man, while the rest of the Norse formed up on the far side. Some say he killed 40 before one clever Saxon floated beneath the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust his spear up through the planks, striking the warrior from below. His name was never kept, but his story was. And so we honor this Viking, whoever he was. Verily, that stand bought time. Enough for the Norse to form the shield wall, iron locked with iron, the old way. The English came pouring across, closed their ranks, and charged. The fight spread out far beyond the bridge, roaring like fire across the field. But the Norse were at a loss. Many had left their mail armor back at the ships, thinking the day would be easy. Aye, they fought hard, but the shield wall couldn't hold. The English gradually pressed in, found the cracks, and then forced their way through. Hardrada took an arrow straight to the throat. Tostig fell beside him, and the wall broke. The Norse line shattered. Then came Eystein Orr, riding from Rikal with the men who had stayed behind to guard the ships. 25 kilometers they came, running full tilt to join the fight. Some dropped dead from the strain, falling where they stood, but the rest formed up and hit the English hard. That charge was called Ari's Storm, and for a breath it turned the tide. But they were too few, The English too many. Orb was struck down, his men followed. The Norse fled. Many tried to cross the rivers, only to be swept under and drowned. The rest were hunted down. It was a slaughter. So many fell in that field, the dead lay aplenty across the earth. And they say that even 50 years on, the bones still showed white where the sun bleached them clean. Orderic Vitalis, an English-born Norman, wrote of it. How the piles of bones marked the place like a scar that would not fade. And so, the proud army that had come in 300 ships could barely fill 24 when the day was done. That's how heavy the cost was. The English king Harold Godwinson gave terms to those few who still stood. Among them, Olaf, son of Hardrada, and Paul Thorfinnsson, Earl of Orkney. They swore not to raise arms against England again, and with that oath they were allowed to leave. The survivors limped back to Orkney and spent the winter there. In spring, Olaf sailed home to Norway. There he shared the throne with his brother Magnus, whom Hardrada had left behind to rule in his stead. Yet Harold's triumph brought him no peace. 3 days later, on the 28th of September, a new threat landed on England's southern shore. William, Duke of Normandy. He came ashore at Pevensey with his invasion host. But that is a story for another time. We have reached the end of this long voyage, just as the great Viking age ended with Harald Hardrada's fall at Stamford Bridge. That day marked the end of the old world. That was the last Viking army to cross the sea in force. And so, by the time Hastings was done, the age of the Northmen in Britain had come to its close.